We're looking at the theme of hearing from God like a servant and hearing from God like a friend. What they have in common is that both need to act on what they hear from God. But where the difference comes in is in what sort of a relationship with God you have. Jesus wants to make us friends, not just servants. Oh yeah, we'll be servants. We'll do what he tells us to do. But he wants to make us into friends. He wants a friendship with us, something warm. I want to share a little testimony of something that happened to me in India a few years ago. In fact, about 15 years ago. I had traveled with a team. I think there were 5 Americans in all. We were hosted by Pastor Philip, who put on a week of open-air meetings very close to where he lived. And that happened in week number 1. And then in week number 2, we drove for several hours, stayed in a hotel, which was about 45 minutes drive away from the village where we had our open-air meetings for the second week. And the second week was like the first. There were many people who were healed, there were many people who got saved, and there were even some situations that happened where churches ended up being planted because of the people who were converted. So both weeks were very successful, but the second week somehow was more difficult than the first. It got hotter than it had been the first week, and some of us had problems with the heat. Some of us had health problems. Some of us had problems with the food. I'll spare you the details. I can tell a lot of funny stories about that second week. But see, the thing of it is, by the end of that week, we had one Sunday service that was going to happen in the church there in the village, and then we all piled into a van to go back to the hotel so we could collect our luggage, and then we would drive the rest of the way back to Pastor Philip's, about 4 hours of driving in all. So at the village church, after the meeting, we all climbed into a van, and this van had 300,000 miles on it. It had leaky exhaust system. It had seats that weren't quite attached to the floor, and it had holes in the floor where rust had eaten up the metal. And so as we drove on that hot day, there was all the dust of the road, and that was coming up through the holes in the floor, as were exhaust fumes. Well, for some reason, that was the day that I began to feel a little less than 100%. And the thought of 4 hours in that van just seemed like, oh my, it was an unbearable thought. But about then, Pastor Philip and one of the Americans who was in another seat up by Pastor Philip, they got into a conversation, and Philip said, "What do you think? Shall we take the van home, or shall we just haul our luggage and our equipment in the van, and I can hire a cab?" And the other man said, "Well, how much is the cab?" And Philip says, $40. He says that's what it costs to basically to provide for a village pastor for a month. And so the other American said, "Oh, Philip, we're fine with the van. We don't need the cab. Save the money." So Philip said, "That's what we'll do then." So we got to the hotel. Well, as we rode the last mile or two to the hotel, I thought, 4 hours of this van. I don't know if I'm going to make it. I didn't say a word to anybody, but I just sat there, and I remember saying in my heart, I guess the worst that can happen is that I would have to ask him to stop the van somewhere down the road, and I could just get out and crawl over to a place on the side of the road and lie down and die. And that's what I thought. But we got to the hotel. We stopped, we went in, we collected our luggage, and we came outside, and there was a taxi. There was Pastor Philip saying, get in, I've hired a cab." So people took our bags and they loaded them into the van, and we all got in the taxi. And as we took off driving, Philip said to the American that he'd talked to earlier, he said, "Maybe you're wondering why I got the cab." And the other American said, "Yeah, we were fine with the van. Why did you get the cab?" And Philip said, "After you and I made our agreement," he says, "I looked back. Jesus spoke to me, and he said, 'Look at Smith.' He said, 'My servant is prepared to suffer for me.' He said, 'Why do you put him through this? Get the cab.' Now, I didn't realize I'd looked like I was suffering that much. I certainly wasn't trying to put on an act to make anything happen. But that was a day when the voice of Jesus melted my heart. Because was my comfort for a few hours worth a month's pay to a village pastor? To me it was not. But to Jesus it was. And I don't understand that, but here's what I want you to notice. I never said a word to Pastor Philip. Now, granted, I can look like I'm suffering, but my word, I probably look like that half the time anyway, so that's no big deal. But Jesus himself stopped Pastor Philip, and he called me a servant, and he treated me like a friend. This is the loving God that wants to talk to you. This is the loving God that wants to lead you and me into a life of acting on his words. But he's not just an efficient boss who is saying, what? $40 for a cab? Oh, let Stan suffer. He'll be all right. I'll take care of him. He won't die. No, that's not the way Jesus thinks. Let's think like Jesus. Let's learn to let him treat us as friends, because he's a God who cares about people. And so that day gave me a window into the heart of God. And that day was a time when I caught on that there's more to being a friend of God than just having him tell me everything that's going on. But there's also a sense, I would like to be a man who is sensitive enough that I would hear from God, even if it's going to cost me strategically. But I would like to be one who would hear when he wants to pour that kind of care upon one of his people.